The dragon who played alones. Deep in the Ashenspire Mountains, where the clouds scraped their bellies against the peaks, and the wind sang through hollow stone like a chorus of things that had never learned to be quiet, there lived a dragon hatchling named Vreth. He was small as dragons went. Embarrassingly small, some might have said, though there was no one on the mountain who knew enough about dragons to say it, and Vreth himself had no frame of reference beyond the distant memory of his mother's shadow, which had been large enough to swallow the sun. His scales were the color of cooling embers, dark charcoal dusted with veins of deep amber that caught the light when he moved and gave the impression, in certain afternoon angles, that something still burned beneath the surface. His underbelly was softer, a pale gray gold that he kept carefully tucked away because it felt private, like the inside of a thought. His wings, the source of the greatest portion of his daily frustration, were still too large for his body in the way that a puppy's paws are too large, full of promise, full of future, and currently full of the capacity to catch crosswinds at precisely the wrong moment and send him lurching sideways into boulders. His horns had only just begun to grow. They were little ivory nubs above each ear, barely longer than his claws, and he could feel them sometimes when the mountain cold settled in a faint pressure, a sense of something becoming. His tail, long and still growing into its own strength, had not yet learned to stay out of his own way, which meant that approximately once every 3 days he would step on it himself while turning too quickly, and the brief moment of shocked pain followed by the deep indignity of the realization never got any less humiliating, even with no one watching. There was never anyone watching, that was rather the whole problem. Vreth lived alone on the mountain shelf he called his ledge, a broad flat outcropping of ancient granite 60 feet above the canyon floor, sheltered on the north side by a wall of stone that broke the worst of the winter wind and caught the morning sun on its face so that it radiated warmth back into the cave through most of the day. The cave itself went back 12 feet into the mountain before it narrowed to a crack too small even for him, a space that smelled of old rock and cold mineral water that seeped through somewhere in the dark and dripped with a rhythm so steady he had stopped hearing it months ago. The cave had belonged to his mother before she had flown south on business that dragons considered too important and too dangerous for hatchlings to follow. He was not entirely certain what that business was. His mother had not explained, because dragons of her age and standing did not explain themselves to hatchlings any more than mountains explain themselves to the birds that nest in their crevices. She had simply told him in the deep resonant language of dragonkind that he felt more in his bones than heard with his ears, that there were things in the south that required her attention, old agreements, old territories. The kind of matters that bore her name in ways that had nothing to do with him yet. She had said yet with the patient certainty of someone describing whether that has not arrived but absolutely will. Before she left, she had done what she could. She had left him a pile of deer bones stripped clean and bleached pale, good for knowing when his jaw muscles ached with the particular soreness of new teeth coming in. She had wedged a fire crystal into a notch in the cave wall near the entrance, a rough chunk of deep red stone that radiated heat without flame, warm enough to keep the worst of the cold from reaching his sleeping place through the long winter nights. And she had delivered her single instruction in the tone that dragons use when they mean a thing completely. Do not leave the mountain, the lowlands are not ready for you. She had not said he was not ready for the lowlands. She had said the lowlands were not ready for him, which was a different thing entirely, and Vreth had turned this distinction over in his mind many times in the weeks since her departure, examining it from different angles the way he examined interesting stones, looking for the facet that would make it fully make sense. He had not found it yet. He suspected it was the kind of thing that would only make sense later, from the other side of some experience he hadn't had yet. He had obeyed the instruction, mostly. He had not gone to the lowlands. That part was easy because the lowlands were genuinely far, and the trail down was long and winding and smelled of things he didn't recognize. And on the 2 occasions he had crept to the very edge of the last switchback and peered down at the green and brown and gray patchwork of the world below the tree line, something old and instinctive had pressed against the underside of his scales and told him not yet. What he had done, what he did with increasing frequency as the weeks stretched out and the boredom pressed harder, was leave the ledge. Not the mountain technically, just the ledge. He explored the canyon system below his shelf, the boulder fields and the frozen streambed and the narrow passages between faces of rock where the wind came through at strange angles and sang different notes than anywhere else. He found a second cave, smaller and wetter than his own, that smelled like something large had lived in it long ago. He found a frozen waterfall on the mountain's east face, blue-white and silent, suspended mid-motion in the cold air. He found a field of enormous boulders, each one taller than he was, arranged in a rough circle that might have been natural and might not have been. And he had spent an entire afternoon in that circle feeling the strange, dense quality of the silence there before deciding it made him uncomfortable and leaving. He explored because it was something to do, and something to do was what he needed more than nearly anything. The problem, the real problem, the one that sat in his chest like a stone that wouldn't warm no matter how close he kept it to the fire crystal, was that Vreth was bored in the specific, desperate way that only young things can be bored. Not the comfortable, drowsy boredom of a long afternoon with nothing pressing. Not the mild restlessness of a creature waiting for something it knows is coming. This was the boredom of a creature built for play, built for company, built for the particular friction and joy of another presence to push against and finding none. It was a boredom that pressed against the inside of his ribs like something trying to get out. It made his small fire glands itch with unspent energy. It made his claws scrape patterns into the granite of his ledge without his meaning them to deep parallel grooves that were getting embarrassingly long. He had tried everything he could think of. He had catalogued his efforts in the obsessive way of the lonely, the way that boredom eventually becomes its own project. He stacked boulders. This was harder than it sounded because the boulders in his canyon were not cooperative. They were round and frost-slick and badly balanced. But he had found a system involving a flat base stone and careful wedging, and he had built 3 towers of increasing height, the tallest reaching nearly twice his own height before the whole arrangement became structurally uncertain. Then he knocked them down with his tail, which was genuinely satisfying for approximately 3 seconds. And then there was rubble everywhere, and he had to either stack them again or look at the rubble. And looking at the rubble was worse than either option. He chased his own smoke rings. This required a specific type of controlled exhale, the kind that produced a ring rather than a stream, which he was still perfecting. About 1 in 4 attempts produced an actual ring, the others being vague clouds of smoke that dispersed immediately and offered nothing to chase. But when he got it right, the ring would drift upward and outward in the cold mountain air, surprisingly stable, turning slowly on some internal axis he couldn't see, and he would leap after it and try to fly through it before it dissolved. He had succeeded twice. Both times he had been so startled by his own success that he'd lost focus and dropped several feet before catching air under his wings again, which had somewhat undermined the achievement. He rolled smooth river stones down the slope. This was his favorite solitary game, the one he returned to most often because it had a competitive element that the others lacked. He would select a stone from his collection, carry it to the high point of the ledge's slope, and release it, and then run after it, and the contest was whether he could catch it before it reached the canyon floor. He had mapped the slope so thoroughly by now that he knew exactly where the stone would bounce, and knew which irregularities in the rock would send it left and which would send it right, and he could catch it more often than not. The times he couldn't, he tumbled after it end over end in a way that would have horrified his mother, wings flapping uselessly against gravity, claws scrabbling for purchase on stone that offered none, until momentum delivered him to the canyon floor alongside the stone with a thud that echoed off the walls and startled the ravens. He practiced roaring at the echo that lived in the far canyon wall. This was the most complicated of his games, and in certain lights the saddest. He had discovered early in his time alone that the canyon's geometry produced an echo with a delay long enough to feel like a response. He would roar, and 2 or 3 seconds later the echo would come rolling back, flattened and changed by the stone but unmistakably an answer. He had developed an elaborate fiction around this. The echo, he decided, was another dragon. A young one like himself. It lived in the far wall somehow in the particular way that things live in places that have no room for them in waking logic but feel absolutely real when the light is right and the loneliness is heavy enough. He called it the wall dragon, and he had conversations with it that were entirely one-sided and that he knew were entirely one-sided, and that helped anyway, in the way that talking to something helps even when the something cannot talk back. But none of it was the same as having someone to play with. Not the echo, not the smoke rings, not the well-mapped slope and the cooperative stones. None of it filled the particular shape of what was missing. Play, real play, Vreth was beginning to understand, though he had no words for the understanding, only the felt sense of absence required another mind. Required the unpredictability of something that made its own choices. Required someone who could surprise you, could change the rules unexpectedly, could win when you expected to win, could be bad at things you were good at and good at things you hadn't considered trying. Required in the most essential way someone else. The other mountain creatures kept their distance, and they kept it with a thoroughness that was starting to feel personal. The mountain goats were the most consistent in their avoidance. They fled the moment they caught his scent, not with the explosive panic of prey that has seen a predator, but with the resigned, experienced efficiency of creatures who have learned through deep ancestral memory that the smell of ember and sulfur means relocation. They didn't run in terror. They simply left, with a quiet pragmatism that Vreth found more deflating than fear would have been. At least fear would have meant he registered as something significant. The goat's departure felt more like weather. They were here, the wind changed, they moved on. He was the wind. Impersonal, unavoidable, nothing to do about it. The hawks circled above his canyon on the thermal that rose from the rock face in the afternoons, and they watched him with the high-focused attention of birds that watch everything, and they never once descended. He had tried lying very still, trying to seem like part of the landscape. He had tried not looking up, giving them his studied indifference. He had tried, this was perhaps the plan he was least proud of in retrospect, mimicking their calls, which had produced a sound so wrong and so alarming that 3 hawks had left the thermal entirely and not returned for 2 days, and the one that remained had regarded him with what he could only interpret as profound offense. Even the ravens, who were the boldest of his mountain neighbors, the most curious, the most willing to come close, even they maintained the precise distance required to steal from him without being stolen from in return. They were attracted, he had worked out, to the shiniest objects in his collection. The fire crystal's light sometimes struck certain stones and threw glints that the ravens could apparently see from substantial distances, because they would appear, 4 or 5 of them, clattering onto the edge of his ledge with the casual entitlement of creatures who have decided the world belongs to whoever arrives first. They would sidle toward the collection, heads tilted, eyes sharp as black glass, and select something, a piece of quartz, a chip of mica, a smooth pebble with an unusual color, and be gone before he could reach them. He didn't really mind the theft. He had collected more stones than he needed, and he found he could collect more. What frustrated him was the precise calibration of the ravens' comfort zone, the way they kept exactly far enough away that he could never close the distance, could never get close enough to do more than watch. He had tried slow approaches, fast approaches, pretending to be asleep. He had tried leaving food out, a piece of deer bone, which the ravens investigated with interest and then ignored in favor of a chunk of rose quartz, which told him something about raven priorities that he filed away without quite knowing why. He had tried to befriend a fox once, in what he now considered his lowest moment of optimism and his highest moment of planning without thinking through. He had spotted the fox on the lower canyon floor, a red-orange flash against gray stone, picking its way through the boulder field with the deliberate, precise foot placement of a creature that trusts nothing it stands on. It was roughly his size. It was clearly intelligent, clearly curious, pausing to sniff at things and tilting its head at sounds in the way that suggested an active inner life. It had a long tail that moved to counterbalance each step, and in this way it reminded Vreth a little of himself, navigating a world where the tail was always involved whether invited or not. He had laid flat on his stomach on the canyon floor, pressing himself against the cold stone, making himself as small as possible. This had required folding his wings in very tight and tucking his tail carefully alongside his body and lowering his neck until his chin touched rock, which was uncomfortable and also covered his throat scales in grit, but he had held it. He had produced what he believed in the planning stage was his most winning expression, open, interested, non-threatening. Something that might communicate friend across the species barrier. The expression, he would later reflect, had involved several rows of teeth, because that was simply how his face was constructed, and even his most benign expression was, from the outside, indistinguishable from a smile with catastrophic intentions. The fox had frozen at 60 feet. It had assessed the situation with the rapid, complete calm of a creature that had evolved its threat assessment to the speed of reflex. And then it had departed, not with the goat's pragmatic efficiency, not with the hawk's dignified withdrawal, but in a low, flat sprint that covered the length of the canyon floor in seconds, red tail flat behind it, gone around the boulder field and out of sight before Vreth had fully registered that his plan had not worked. He had remained flat on the canyon floor for a while after, chin on the cold stone, thinking about expressions and teeth and the particular cruelty of being built in a way that made ordinary friendliness look like a threat. The grit had worked into the joints of his throat scales and itched for the rest of the day. So Vreth played alone, and the mountain echoed with the sounds of his solitary games, the crack of stacked boulders falling, the soft tumble of stone down a slope, the lonely bellow of a young dragon testing his voice against a canyon wall that only knew how to answer in kind, and no one echoed back in the way that mattered. The echo was always there, faithful and hollow and shaped exactly like absence. The mountain went on being a mountain, vast and cold, and utterly indifferent to the small amber-veined creature who had claimed one ledge of it, and filled it with games that were waiting to become something else. He had taken to sitting at the very edge of the ledge in the late afternoons, when the light went gold and flat and long, and watching the lower canyon with the patient, reflexive attention of a creature that has learned to watch without expecting. The canyon floor was usually empty. Sometimes a goat appeared and left, sometimes ravens. Once, memorably, a shape in the high sky that was too large to be a hawk, and that had made his heart do something strange and complicated before it resolved into a distant eagle, and the strange, complicated feeling resolved into something quieter and harder to name. He watched because watching was something to do. He watched because the eye needs somewhere to rest when the mind is restless. He watched the way all lonely creatures eventually learn to watch, not with hope exactly, but with the posture of hope, the muscle memory of it, the habit of looking outward maintained against all reasonable expectation. He was watching on the afternoon, the small human boy fell into his canyon. He heard at first a skittering of disturbed rock from somewhere above the canyon's east wall, the particular accelerating sound of a rockslide that starts small and then changes its mind, followed by a short and sharp human sound that carried in the cold air with the clarity of something unexpected. Then a cascade of smaller stones pattering down the wall face. Then a thud that hit the canyon floor and echoed once, clean and final. Then silence. Vreth was off the ledge before he had made a decision about it, moving down the slope with the low, quick motion he used when something required investigation rather than caution, tail out for balance, wings half spread as instinctive stabilizers following the direction the sound had come from. His heart was doing the strange, complicated thing again. He didn't know what he was going to find. He didn't know what he was hopping to find. He came around the shoulder of the large boulder that marked the canyon's east turn and stopped. There was a creature lying on the canyon floor approximately 10 feet from the base of the wall. It was small, surprisingly, almost shockingly small, and it was shaped in the odd vertical way of humans, though it was currently horizontal, flat on its back on the rock, arms out to its sides, staring up at the gray winter sky with an expression that suggested the sky had done something to it personally. It wore layers of wrapped cloth in brown and gray, one knee of its lower coverings torn to show pink skin beneath. Its head had a covering of dark hair compressed under a wool cap that had gone sideways in the fall. Its hands were palm up beside it, and Vreth could see, even from this distance, the reddened marks of scraped skin across the palms. It was alive, its chest moved. Its breath came in small visible clouds in the cold air. It had not seen him yet. Vreth stood very still, which was not a thing he was generally good at, and looked at the human boy on the canyon floor, and felt something shifting inside his chest in a way that had nothing to do with his fire glands or his aching horns or the familiar hollow press of boredom. He took one step forward very carefully, the way he had once moved toward the fox. His shadow fell across the human boy's face. The boy turned his head slowly and looked directly at him. And Vreth, for the first time in longer than he could meaningfully remember, was seen. The boy who was not afraid very much. His name was Tomlin, and he was 8 years old, and he had been absolutely, categorically, with full eye contact and a pointed finger forbidden from climbing the Ashenspire Trail alone. His mother had said it. His father had agreed with it, which was significant because his father rarely agreed with prohibitions on principle, holding the general philosophical position that boys needed room to make mistakes and that mistakes were the architecture of character. His older sister Bria had said it too, but she was 12 and said everything in the tone of someone administering a verdict, so Tomlin had filed her contributions separately from the others. The village shepherd, Old Caddock, who had lived longer than most people Tomlin knew and who distributed warnings the way other people distributed good mornings, had said it specifically and with unusual detail, had said the Ashenspire Trail was unstable in the cold months, that the scree on the east face moved without warning, that the canyon below was deep and unfriendly to people who landed in it. Tomlin had listened to all of this with the attentive expression he had developed over 8 years of being told things he intended to remember, and then not always remember at the critical moment. He had done it anyway. In his defense, and he had been composing this defense in the back of his mind even before the scree field gave way, in the optimistic, pre-disaster portion of the climb where everything still seemed manageable, he had not intended to go far. He had not intended to go anywhere near the east face. He had simply been walking the lower edge of the trail, the safe part, the part that was essentially just a wide path between the village's upper fields and the place where the mountain truly began, and he had seen the stone. It was lying on an outcropping perhaps 30 feet above the trail, visible from below in the way that only the best stones are visible, catching light at exactly the right angle to broadcast its quality to anyone with the eyes and the inclination to notice. And Tomlin had both. He had been collecting stones since he was 5, and in 3 years of dedicated collection he had developed the instinct for them, the quick assessment that separated an ordinary rock from something worth carrying. This stone was gray, but a gray with depth to it, with what looked like threads of darker color running through its surface. It was large, larger than any single stone in his collection, and it was, from 30 feet below, almost perfectly round. A perfectly round stone of that size and quality was not a thing you walked away from. This was simply a fact, as true as the cold and the mountain and the absolute prohibition he was currently revising in his mind from categorical to strongly suggested. The climb up to the outcropping had been straightforward for the first 20 feet. The rock was solid, the handholds obvious, the kind of climbing that didn't feel like climbing so much as walking at an angle. Then the character of the ground changed, became looser, grittier, the rock less committed to staying in place under his boots. And he had recognized, with the part of his mind that processed information his body was already receiving, that old Cadec's warning about the east face scree had been topographically accurate. He had been in the process of deciding whether to continue or retreat when the scree field made the decision for him. It did not give way all at once, which might have been more dignified. It gave way progressively, the way trust gives way, one piece, then the piece beside it, then suddenly everything all at once. His left boot went first, finding nothing solid beneath it. His right boot compensated, found the same nothing. His hands grabbed for the rock face and found it moving too, the whole surface suddenly in collective motion. And then he was sliding, not falling yet, sliding down a river of loose stone that was making a sound like applause. He slid, then he rolled, which was the part that involved the most elbow and the most noise from himself, sounds he was not proud of. Then the sliding and rolling combination delivered him to the canyon edge and past it, and he dropped briefly through cold air and landed. The thump knocked the breath from him with a completeness that was almost interesting, if you were the type to find interesting things in the middle of disasters, which Tomlin generally was. His lungs simply stopped for a moment, suspended, and the world went very still and very gray, and all he could see was the sky above the canyon walls, winter pale and vast and entirely unbothered by what had just happened to him. He lay there on his back on the canyon floor and conducted a damage assessment with the methodical calm that had always been his particular quality in moments of crisis. A stillness that puzzled his parents and occasionally unsettled his teachers, who expected tears and received instead a boy lying on the ground counting his injuries with the focused expression of someone taking inventory. Scraped palms. He could feel them already, the hot shallow burn of skin taken off against stone, the grit embedded in the lines of his hands, not deep, not dangerous. Unpleasant in the way scraped palms are always unpleasant, which is disproportionately so given the actual damage involved. Bruised pride. He added this to the list with the honesty of a boy who had learned that accounting for pride was necessary if you wanted an accurate picture of your situation. He had been forbidden from this climb. He had done it anyway. He had done it badly. These facts would need to be reckoned with eventually, and pretending the pride wasn't injured would not make the reckoning easier. One torn knee of his breeches. He could feel the cold air on the skin beneath, could feel the slight sting that suggested the stone had made contact with the skin as well as the fabric. This was going to require an explanation, and the explanation was going to require either a lie or a truth, and Tomlin had found through 8 years of practice that lies required significantly more maintenance than truths and tended to collapse at inconvenient moments. He filed the explanation requirement under problems for later and moved on. Everything else seemed to be in order. His head was intact. His ribs registered mild complaint but nothing that suggested structural damage. His ankles, which had been his primary concern during the actual fall, were fine, slightly jarred but solid. He was, all things considered, largely unhurt. He was also, all things considered, at the bottom of a canyon he had been forbidden to approach, with scraped hands and torn breeches and a wool cap that had gone sideways on his head during the tumbling, and was currently sitting at an angle that would have made his mother close her eyes briefly before addressing the larger situation. He reached up and straightened the cap. It seemed important to have at least one thing in order. He was lying there, staring at the gray winter sky and beginning to plan his return route. There would be a way out of the canyon, there was always a way out. You just had to look for it calmly and not panic. Panicking was the enemy of practical thinking. This was something he knew when the shadow fell. It came from his left side, moving across his field of vision with a deliberateness that shadows from clouds do not have. This was a shadow with edges, with shape, with the quality of something casting it rather than something caused by the absence of light. It fell across his face and chest and the cold stone around him, and it was, he noted with the still calm part of his mind, large enough to block the pale winter sun entirely. The sound came at the same moment, or perhaps just after. He would not be able to reconstruct the exact sequence later, because the sound occupied his attention so completely that it reorganized his memory of the preceding second. It emerged from somewhere above and to his left, from whatever was casting the shadow, and it was not quite a growl. A growl was a sound with a specific grammar to it, a statement of warning or readiness, and this was not quite that. It was not quite a hiss either, which would have been a sound of pressure and urgency. It was something in between, something that did not fit neatly into the categories he had available, a resonant questioning sound that was low enough to vibrate in his chest cavity and do something interesting to the air in his lungs. Tomlin turned his head, slowly. The way you turn your head when you suspect that the speed of your movement matters, when something in the situation suggests that sudden motion is inadvisable and that whatever comes next will be at least partly determined by the quality of your stillness. The dragon hatchling was staring at him from 3 feet away. In the stories, and there were many stories, because the village sat below mountains that had always had dragons in them historically, even if dragons had not been reliably sighted in recent generations. In the stories, dragons were enormous, castle-sized, their wings blocked out the sky. Their breath was not a sneeze but a river of fire, a torrent, a thing that turned fortresses to rubble. Their scales were armor, impenetrable, glittering like a king's treasury, animated and made aggressive. Their eyes were coals, burning red-orange, the color of destruction. They ate knights for sport, which said something both about the dragons and about the relative entertainment value of knights. They were ancient, vast, terrible, the kind of thing that required heroes and songs and considerable loss of life to address. This dragon was about the size of a large dog. A big dog, admittedly. A dog at the larger end of the scale, the kind of dog that had an impressive presence and could put its paws on your shoulders and look you in the eye. But a dog-sized thing, scaled and winged, and currently regarding him with its neck craned slightly forward, and its wings half open for balance, and its nostrils doing something that suggested active information gathering. Its eyes were amber. Not burning, not red, not the coals of the stories amber, the deep clear yellow-brown of tree resin with light behind it, enormous in the narrow angular face, wider than they perhaps needed to be for simple vision and therefore, Tomlin concluded, intended by nature for something more than seeing. They were, he thought, in the particular suspended clarity that settles over a person when the available options have reduced to a small and manageable number. And panic has been crowded out by the simple necessity of paying attention, extraordinarily curious eyes. He had expected terror, his own terror, the kind that moves the body before the mind catches up and produces flight or screaming or both simultaneously. He had expected his legs to be trying to take him somewhere his brain hadn't decided yet. He knew this was what was supposed to happen. He had heard about it, had seen it in other people when they encountered things that startled them, the body's fast, bright certainty overwhelming the slower, deliberate self. But the strange calm had settled over him instead, the same calm that came over him when he fell and lay still counting injuries, the same calm that came over him when he was in a situation where his options had clarified to a small number and panic was simply not among them. The calm of a boy who, when faced with the genuinely extraordinary, tended to find it fascinating before he found it frightening. The dragon hatchling was staring at him. Its eyes were curious. Its wings were open in what if it had been a cat, and Tomlin kept this comparison carefully in the back of his mind because he understood that it was an inexact comparison and that the creature in front of him would not appreciate being compared to a cat, would have read as a posture of startled alertness. It had seen him but not yet decided what to do about him. It was, he understood with sudden simple clarity, waiting to see what he would do. This, Tomlin grasped without having to reason through it, was probably the most important thing. He sat up. He moved slowly, unfolding himself from the canyon floor with the care of someone who is demonstrating something, not I am not a threat exactly, because he wasn't sure that category was available to him, but something more like I am predictable. I am doing the thing I appear to be doing. There are no surprises coming from my direction. The dragon flinched back 2 steps, immediate and quick, claws scraping the stone. Its wings flared wider, reflexive, a balance correction and a preparation for the possibility of altitude simultaneously. The amber eyes widened further. Then it stopped and it looked at him, and it did not leave. This seemed important. In Tomlin's experience, things that were going to leave left when you moved. The mountain goats left. He had seen them from the trail on many occasions, seen the way they assessed and then departed. The ravens left when you came too close, lifted off the fence post or the rock with a clatter of black wings and a sound of reproach. Things that intended to leave left. The dragon hatchling had flinched and not left. It had stepped back and reassessed and was still standing there, 3 feet plus 2 extra steps away, watching him with those enormous amber eyes, and it was staying. They regarded each other. The silence was the mountain kind, not empty but full of small sounds, wind through the canyon walls, the distant creak of cold rock, the thin high whistle of air through some passage he couldn't see. In it, Tomlin and the dragon breathed their respective visible breaths, each puff of cold weather exhalation hanging briefly in the air between them before dissolving, small evidence of warmth in a cold place, small evidence of life encountering life. "Hello," said Tomlin. He said it because he had been raised to be polite, which was true, and because he could not think of anything else to say, which was also true, but more deeply he said it because it felt like the right size of thing. He had a sense, not reasoned, not articulate, just felt that the situation called for something small, something that didn't have too much weight to it. Something that could be received by a creature that had no way to evaluate its meaning, except through tone and posture, and the quality of the silence that came before and after it. Hello was small, hello was calm. Hello was a thing that asked almost nothing of the thing it was addressed to, required nothing in return, carried no demand and no urgency. The dragon tilted its head. The gesture was so recognizable, so exactly the gesture of a creature processing something new, trying to find the angle from which it would resolve into sense, that Tomlin felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight since the moment the shadow fell. The tilt of the head was a dog gesture, a bird gesture, a thinking gesture, and a creature that tilted its head at an unfamiliar sound was a creature that was curious before it was anything else. A thin curl of smoke drifted from one nostril, lazy and pale against the gray air, dissipating almost immediately. Not aggressive smoke, not warning smoke. The smoke of a creature that was simply breathing, simply existing, simply present. Tomlin reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, everything slowly, every motion with that same quality of I am doing what I appear to be doing, I am not constructing surprises, I am being transparent about my hands. He reached in and found what he was looking for immediately, the weight and smoothness of it unmistakable even through the cloth of his gloves. The stone. He had forgotten he'd put it in his pocket. He had grabbed it from the outcropping in the first instance before the scree gave way, tucked it away in the motion of a boy who does not yet know that the world is about to change its angle. It had survived the fall with him, had ridden in his pocket through the sliding and the rolling and the drop and the thump, and here it was, the stone he had climbed an off-limits trail for, the stone that had started all of this, heavy and round and satisfying in his palm even through the glove. He brought his hand out of his pocket and held the stone out, not quite extended toward the dragon, not offering exactly. The difference was important and he felt it even if he couldn't have named it. Not here, take this, which would have required the dragon to make a decision about approach and might have felt like pressure. Just here, look at this, just showing, just making the stone available to be seen, adding it to the conversation without forcing it. It was a good stone, he believed this completely. Heavy and round, satisfying in the palm, the gray with depth to it, the threads of darker color he had seen from the trail winding through its surface in patterns that looked almost intentional. A stone worth climbing for, even in retrospect, even with the scraped hands and the torn breeches and the explanations ahead. Vreth stared at it. The amber eyes found the stone and fixed on it with a focus that was different from the wide, watchful attention he had been giving Tomlin, sharper, more specific. The focus of a creature that has recognized something that belongs in the category of worth investigating. He stared at the stone the way Tomlin had stared at it from the trail below, with the recognition of quality, and something about this made Tomlin feel a sudden and illogical sense of kinship with the creature that had nothing to do with size or shape or species, and everything to do with the shared knowledge of a good stone. Then Vreth stared at the boy, then at the stone, then at the boy again, the amber eyes moving between the two, conducting some private calculation, working something out. He crept forward, one step, careful and deliberate, placed with the concentrated attention of a creature that is overriding its instincts with its curiosity and knows it and is doing it anyway. Then a second step, slightly less deliberate, slightly more committed. The distance between them closed from 5 feet to 3 feet to less than 2. He lowered his nose to the stone. What followed was one of the most thorough acts of olfactory investigation Tomlin had ever witnessed, and he had watched a bloodhound work once, which he had thought at the time was the outer limit of dedicated smelling. Vreth's nostrils, narrow slits on a scaled snout, each one currently flared to what appeared to be maximum capacity, worked over the stone with exhaustive, systematic dedication, moving in small increments from one end of the stone to the other, pausing over interesting sections, returning to some, moving on from others. Tomlin held very still and watched this process with genuine respect for its thoroughness. Whatever information the stone contained in its smell, Vreth was collecting all of it. Then he sneezed. It was a real sneeze, involuntary, complete, the kind that arrives before the body has time to moderate it. It snapped his head forward and produced, from both nostrils simultaneously, a small sharp jet of flame, pale orange at the core and almost invisible at the edges, that shot forward and caught the sleeve of Tomlin's jacket. The sleeve burned for approximately 1 second before the flame went out, leaving a singed patch the size of a palm, brown at the edges, the smell of scorched wool rising into the cold air between them. Tomlin looked at his sleeve, then he looked at the dragon. Vreth had gone rigid, not the alert rigidity of a creature preparing for something, the rigid, wide-eyed stillness of a creature that has just done something it did not intend to do and is now waiting, with the particular suspended dread of the very young for what happens next. The amber eyes were enormous. The curl of his neck had gone stiff. Even his tail, which Tomlin had noticed in motion before, had gone completely still against the canyon floor. He looked in this moment exactly like every child Tomlin had ever seen in the instant after an accident. The frozen moment before consequence arrived, the moment of hopping that the dropped thing hadn't broken, that the spilled thing hadn't stained, that the spoken thing could somehow be taken back and reconsidered. Tomlin looked at him, he looked at his sleeve. He thought about what was actually true, which was that his sleeve was singed but his arm was not harmed, that the fire had been small and brief and clearly unintentional, and that the creature in front of him was looking at him with an expression that he recognized entirely. "That's all right," he said, immediately firmly with the conviction of someone who means what they say and wants it understood. "It was clearly an accident." He paused, then because it was true and because it felt like the right kind of thing to add, "I do that too, sneeze at the wrong moment, not fire obviously." A brief glance at the singed sleeve, acknowledging the difference without dwelling on it. But still. He watched something happen in Vreth's. It was a gradual thing, the way all real changes are gradual when you are close enough to witness them. The rigidity softened. Not all at once, not in a single releasing exhale, but in increments, first in the neck, which lost its stiffness and allowed the head to drop a fraction, then in the wings, which folded slightly inward, then in the tail, which began to move again in small, unconscious arcs against the stone, the motion of a creature whose body had resumed its ordinary traffic. The amber eyes remained wide, but lost the frozen dread quality, returning to something closer to the curiosity that had been there from the beginning. The posture changed fraction by fraction, like ice at the edge of a stream that has not decided to melt, but is finding the temperature too persuasive to resist. Tomlin set the stone down between them on the rock. He placed it carefully, in the approximate middle of the space between his boot and Vreth's nearest claw, and took his hand away slowly and sat back. It was an offering now. It had been showing before, and now it was something else, not given, not surrendered, but placed in the shared space between them, available to both, belonging to neither, the way the best things between two parties sometimes work. Vreth looked at the stone for a long moment. Looked at it with the focused amber attention that Tomlin was beginning to understand was his natural mode of engagement with things that interested him, the look that meant "I am taking this seriously." Then he looked at Tomlin's. Then with a deliberateness that struck Tomlin immediately as conscious, not reflexive, not instinctive, but chosen, Vreth extended one clawed foot and batted the stone sideways. Not toward himself, not away from Tomlin. Sideways at an angle in a direction that was neither claiming nor dismissing, a direction that sent the stone skittering across the canyon floor with a bright scraping sound and left it rattling to a stop approximately equidistant from both of them, but closer to Tomlin's side. Tomlin watched the stone skitter, watched it rattle, watched it stop. He looked up at Vreth's. Vreth was watching the stone too, but his head had tilted again, that thinking tilt, that what comes next tilt, and the amber eyes moved from the stone to Tomlin's face with an expression that was asking something, and the thing it was asking was not complicated. The question was not complicated at all. Tomlin stopped the stone with his boot, felt the weight of it settle against his soul, round and heavy and exactly as good as he had believed from 30 feet below. Then he pushed it back, not kicked, pushed, deliberate and controlled, sending it back across the canyon floor in a line that would bring it to rest in Vreth's space. Vreth stopped it with his tail. The tail swung with a precision that seemed offhand but probably wasn't, catching the stone and redirecting it in a new direction entirely, sending it off at an angle toward the canyon wall, slower now, less urgent, a direction that required both of them to move to follow it. They moved. And that was how it started, not with a decision, not with a negotiation, not with any agreement that either of them could have articulated if asked. With a stone and a push and a tail and a redirect, and two creatures in a cold canyon finding without having looked for it, the thing that neither of them had known was specifically missing until the precise moment it arrived. With a game, with playing. With the ancient, wordless, entirely uncomplicated joy of something to do with someone to do it with, after too long of something to do alone. The mountain watched as it always watched, vast and cold and old beyond accounting. But something on the canyon floor was warm. What dragons and boys have in common. They played until the light changed. Not the light of clouds moving or the brief dimming of a passing shadow, the real light change, the one that happened in the late afternoon of winter days when the sun dropped behind the western peak and the quality of everything shifted at once, the gold going out of the air and the blue coming in, the cold deepening by several degrees in the space of minutes, the mountains asserting their true nature after spending the middle of the day in a temporary warmth that had always been borrowed. That light change. The one that meant the day had turned the corner it couldn't uncorner. They played through all the hours before that, and the hours were not short. It began with the stone, the good gray stone, heavy and round, the one that had caused the climb and the fall and the singed sleeve and the beginning of everything. And the stone turned out to be an excellent object for a game with no agreed-upon rules, which was, Tomlin would later reflect, probably the best kind of game. A game with rules was a structure, and structures required agreement, and agreement required communication, and communication between an 8-year-old boy and a dragon hatchling who shared no language was not a thing that could be established quickly enough for rules to be useful. So they played without them, and what emerged was something that was half keep away and half chase and half something else entirely. A third half, which was mathematically incorrect but emotionally accurate, which was simply the shared joy of movement after too long being still. It was a joy that had a specific physical quality to it. Tomlin had felt it before, on the first warm day after a long winter when his legs remembered what running was for, or on the morning after a sickness had kept him inside for days, and he was allowed out again, and the ordinary world felt vivid and excessive with sensation. The joy of a body that has been held in place for too long and is now released into space. Vreth moved like that joy too, with an excess of energy that the canyon could barely contain, changing direction with sudden urgency, chasing the stone past where the stone had stopped, lapping the canyon floor in full sprints that served no particular tactical purpose but seemed necessary the way breathing is necessary, as though the movement itself was the point of the movement. They were, in this way, perfectly matched in their need for it, if not in the form it took. Tomlin discovered things about Vreth through the playing, the way you can only discover things about another creature by moving alongside it. He discovered that Vreth was faster than he looked on flat rock, much faster, startlingly fast. The kind of fast that arrived before you expected it and was already past you before you had fully registered its arrival. His legs, short and powerful relative to the body they supported, drove him across smooth ground with a quick efficiency that made Tomlin's best running feel exploratory by comparison. He moved with his head low and his tail out for balance and his wings half open, not for flight but for the same reason a tightrope walker holds their arms out. And on the flat sections of the canyon floor he was simply, cleanly, inarguably quicker. On the slopes, however, he was a different creature entirely. Slopes were Tomlin's domain, and he reclaimed them with a thoroughness that felt like justice for all the flat ground defeats. The problem with Vreth on a slope was architectural. His wings, those oversized, promise-filled wings that were clearly intended for a larger body that had not yet arrived, caught the mountain wind at wrong angles the moment the terrain changed, converting themselves from useful balance aids into enthusiastic saboteurs. A gust from the north face would catch the left wing and rotate him. A thermal rising from the sun-warmed rock would get under both wings simultaneously and lift his back end, while his front end was still committed to a downward trajectory, resulting in a kind of unintentional pivot that sent him spinning sideways across the slope with an expression of profound offense, as though the wind had done something personally insulting rather than merely physical. Tomlin had learned to move on slopes by years of running through the village's surrounding hills, the kind of competence that lives in the feet and ankles rather than the thinking mind, the automatic small adjustments that keep a person upright on uneven ground. He could descend a rocky incline at a run, picking his line 3 steps ahead, each foot placement decided by his body before his brain had finished the suggestion. On the slopes, he was not faster than Vreth. He was a different order of thing, a creature whose design was appropriate to the terrain in a way Vreth's was not yet. Yet he added this qualification instinctively and did not examine it closely. It seemed important somehow. They knocked stones down the slope and raced after them, a game that had evolved naturally from the original stone game, after Tomlin had accidentally demonstrated the entertainment potential of a well-placed kick that sent a flat stone skimming down the canyon's longest slope in a straight, determined line. Vreth had watched this stone travel, amber eyes tracking it with sharp attention, and then looked at Tomlin with an expression that communicated unmistakably. Again. So they did it again, and then again. And eventually what was again became a race, became a contest, became a thing with stakes that neither of them had assigned but both of them felt. Vreth won the straight sections. The physics were unavoidable. When the slope was smooth and long and the terrain was forgiving, he covered the distance with that same low, efficient sprint, wings catching just enough air to extend each stride without quite leaving the ground, and he arrived at the bottom stone breathlessly first every time. Tomlin took the technical sections, the slopes interrupted by ledges, by outcroppings, by the places where the stone changed character and required navigation rather than speed. Here, Vreth's wings became liabilities again, catching and billowing at awkward moments, and Tomlin's feet found the angles and angles found the route, and he arrived, occasionally, ahead. They kept no score. Score would have required a mutual acknowledgement of points, would have required a shared mathematics, and their mathematics was still rudimentary. But Tomlin knew whether he had won or lost any given race, and Vreth knew it too. The winner received a specific treatment, a sort of restless, focused attention from the other that was either generous acknowledgement or impatient desire to go again, which amounted to the same thing. The loser, if that was the right word, was already moving back up the slope before the winner had caught their breath. The throwing contest emerged from a demonstration rather than a proposal. Vreth had been examining the stone collection he kept on his ledge. Tomlin had learned about the ledge by following Vreth up the canyon wall at one point, and had been struck by the collection, the careful arrangement of stones by some system he couldn't decode, the fire crystal warm in the cave mouth, the general evidence of a creature who had been making a home of a place with whatever materials it had available. While Vreth showed him the collection with the barely contained pride of someone displaying work they're glad to finally have witnessed, Tomlin had picked up a flat throwing stone from the canyon floor, a disc of shale perfect in weight and shape, and had thrown it without thinking, the unconscious, pleasurable flick of the wrist that produced a good skip on flat water, adapted for distance on the mountain air. The stone flew, considerably further than he had expected actually. The cold mountain air had density to it, the kind that a well-thrown flat stone rode efficiently, and it clattered off the far canyon wall at a distance that Tomlin immediately and honestly assessed as one of his better throws. Vreth had watched the stone's entire flight with total attention. Then he looked at Tomlin. Then he picked up a stone from the ledge, a different one, rounder, heavier, and threw it. Saying Vreth threw it was perhaps imprecise in a technical sense. He used his forepaw rather than a hand, and the motion had less of the wrist snap and more of a full-body lean and release that engaged his entire front quarter. The mechanics were different. The result was not. The stone went further than Tomlin's. Significantly further. It hit the canyon wall several feet above and considerably to the right of where Tomlin's stone had impacted, and the sound of its arrival was a deeper, more authoritative crack, the sound of more mass arriving at higher velocity. Tomlin stood and looked at where Vreth's stone had hit. Then he looked at Vreth. Vreth was looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard not to be smug and failing in the gentle, appealing way that smugness fails when it is accompanied by genuine goodwill. "Right," said Tomlin, "that's fair." He tried 3 more times with different stones, finding the best throwing stones the canyon floor offered, applying all the technique he had developed over 8 years of throwing things at other things. The gap between his results and Vreth's was consistent and undeniable. Vreth was stronger, simply, in the way that a creature built from different materials is stronger, and he threw with an engagement of his whole body that Tomlin's human shoulder joint, optimized for a different range of tasks, could not reproduce. Tomlin accepted this defeat with a grace that was genuine rather than performed, which Vreth seemed to understand, in fact, to appreciate with a warmth that was visible in the way the rigidity left his posture entirely. Gracious losing was something Vreth had perhaps not witnessed before, had perhaps not had the opportunity to witness, and he received it with a quality of attention that suggested he was filing it away somewhere important. This was the thing Tomlin was noticing, the thread he kept finding beneath the games, beneath the running and the throwing and the redirecting of stones. Vreth paid attention, not in the distracted, half-present way that Tomlin's schoolmates paid attention to things that interested them, always with one eye on the door or one ear cocked for something better. Vreth paid the attention of a creature for whom every moment of this was new. Every game that emerged from their play was received with the full weight of his focus, considered seriously, engaged with completely. He paid attention to Tomlin the way Tomlin was not used to being paid attention to, with both amber eyes, with the full orientation of his body, with the slight head tilt that meant something was being processed and stored, as if Tomlin were, and this was a strange thing to feel, strange and warm and unfamiliar, interesting. Not interesting because Tomlin was performing or explaining or demonstrating, just interesting, in himself, as a thing encountered in the world that was worth full engagement. Tomlin was 8 years old and did not have the vocabulary for what this felt like, only the felt sense of it, warm in his chest the way the fire crystal was warm at the cave mouth. He did not examine it. He simply moved with it, played with it present, the way you run with a following wind. They used their respective advantages without agreement, without discussion, simply nodding what worked and deploying it, negotiating through action the way creatures always negotiate when they don't share words. When the flat ground stretched long, Vreth ran ahead and Tomlin didn't contest it. When the terrain complicated, Tomlin moved to the front and Vreth pulled his wings in tight and followed, watching the line Tomlin chose with the attentive study of something learning. When the throwing contest settled into its decisive conclusion, Tomlin gracefully ceded the category. When the gap between boulders' route became useful, and it became useful several times, in a game that developed fluidly from the stone contest into something more like outright chase, Tomlin disappeared into spaces that the laws of Vreth's geometry made inaccessible. The cheating came into it at the third boulder gap. Tomlin had gone in flat, the way you enter a tight space, angling his shoulders and moving sideways through a crack between 2 large boulders that were 1.5 feet apart. It was dark inside, the afternoon light not penetrating past the first few inches, and he pressed his back against the cold stone and grinned into the dimness, listening to Vreth arrive outside, hearing the scrape of claws and the huff of a creature assessing an entrance it could not use and the particular quality of silence that meant frustration being processed. Then light appeared. Not the crack of daylight kind, a warm orange light dancing, the light of something burning rather than the light of something revealed. It flooded the gap with a thoroughness that eliminated the advantage of the dark entirely, and Tomlin blinked in it and looked toward the gap entrance and found Vreth there, neck extended to its maximum, pouring a careful, controlled, extremely deliberate tongue of flame into the crevice like someone lighting a lamp. He was not trying to hit Tomlin. The flame was placed with precision, landing on the rock face above Tomlin's head and illuminating rather than burning, the light doing the work without the heat. It was, Tomlin recognized immediately, a considered choice. Not an accident this time, not a sneeze, an applied solution to a specific problem. That is cheating, Tomlin announced, with the moral clarity of someone who has been outflanked. Vreth removed the flame and looked at him through the gap with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, among them. I am not entirely certain that word means what you are using it to mean, but your tone suggests displeasure, and I note that you are leaving the gap, which was the desired outcome so. Cheating? Tomlin repeated, emerging from the crack and brushing stone dust from his jacket, trying and failing to keep the tone completely serious. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was trying not to smile at something he should probably be firmer about. Vreth watched this internal struggle with the focused amber attention of a creature that was learning to read faces, and when the smile won, as it always did, eventually, he made a sound. A small sound, something Tomlin hadn't heard from him yet. A short, low sound from somewhere in his throat that was not a growl and not the resonant questioning vibration of earlier, but something that sat between those things with a lighter quality. A sound that had warmth in it. A sound that was the closest thing to a laugh that Vreth's architecture currently supported. Tomlin laughed out loud, the way children laugh when they have been holding it and then stop, and the canyon returned it in the echo that lived in the far wall. And for the first time since Vreth had learned the echo's particular quality, he heard it and did not feel the hollow ache of it. Because the canyon held another sound too, the real sound, the one that mattered, the actual laughter of an actual creature who was actually here. They ran until they were tired. Then they walked, and the walking had a companionable quality, side by side when the canyon floor was wide enough, single file through the narrow passages with a comfortable alternation of who led. Tomlin talked because talking was something he did and silence was something he tolerated rather than sought, and it turned out that talking to a creature who could not respond verbally was a different kind of talking. He couldn't explain himself, couldn't ask and receive, couldn't offload the social responsibility of conversation to another speaker. He just talked. He said things. He described what he was seeing, what he was thinking, occasional details about his life that surfaced without particular reason, the way thoughts surface when you're moving. He told Vreth about the stone collection at home, about the specific system he used to organize it, about the one gray-blue piece of polished flint that was his best piece before today. He told Vreth about his father's workshop and the smell of wood shavings, and the way the tools hung on their hooks in order of size. He told Vreth that his sister Bria was excellent at things that required patience and terrible at things that required speed, and that the combination meant she was very good at arguments, which he was still developing a satisfactory counter-strategy for. Vreth listened to all of this with complete attention, amber eyes moving to Tomlin's face when the talking started and staying there in a way that, after the first few minutes, stopped feeling unusual and started feeling natural. He responded in his own way, not with sounds that approximated words but with the physical language of a creature that communicated through body and motion. The head tilt for things that struck him as interesting, a specific way of widening his nostrils slightly that seemed to correspond to things that were surprising, the slow arcing tail movement that Tomlin had come to associate with contentment. He was not passive. He was not simply receiving. He was responding in the register available to him, and once Tomlin learned to read the register, it was not so different from conversation. This was a discovery that sat in Tomlin's chest alongside the warmth and the good tired feeling of a body well used. That conversation was not only words. That understanding moved through other channels, that two creatures sufficiently attentive to each other could navigate toward meaning without the shared vocabulary his teachers had always described as the irreducible requirement of communication. He had no word for this discovery. He was 8, and the vocabulary for it had not been given to him yet. But he felt it solid and true, the way the good stone had felt solid and true in his pocket through the fall, something worth keeping, something that would still be there when he checked for it later. The light changed. It happened in the way it always happened, gradually, then suddenly. The gold left the air first, that particular warmth color that the mountain light carried in the middle of the day, and then the blue came in behind it, the cold, clear blue of winter late afternoon, and the shadows lengthened all at once in the way that shadows have, as if they had been waiting for permission. The temperature dropped, and it dropped fast, and Tomlin felt it across the back of his neck first the way he always felt cold, the sensitive strip of skin between his collar and his cap that registered weather changes before any other part of him. He stopped moving. He had not been thinking about time with the specific attention it deserved. He had been aware of it in the peripheral way, aware that it was passing, aware that the day had a finite length, but the playing had occupied the foreground of his attention so completely that time had been relegated to the background. And now it surfaced with the cold and the changed light, and he understood, with the cold horror that is very specific to the moment when you realize the adults who told you to be home were right to tell you. He had been gone far too long. Not a little long, not the kind of long that could be addressed with an apology and a reasonable explanation. The kind of long that would mean people had started wondering, and wondering had become worrying, and worrying might by now have become looking. The kind of long that meant his mother had likely stood at the door twice and looked up the hill and not seen him and closed the door and stood at it again. The kind of long that would require more than an explanation, that would require an accounting. He stood still for a moment with this knowledge, feeling the weight of it settle fully, and then he stood up straighter and brushed the stone dust from his knees and said what was simply, plainly true. "I have to go." Vreth went still. Not the startled stillness of earlier, not the frozen dread of the accidental flame, a different stillness, quieter, with a different quality that Tomlin felt rather than analyzed. The tail stopped its arcing motion. The wings, which had been in the easy half-open rest position they defaulted to when Vreth was relaxed, folded in slowly. The amber eyes, which had been warm with the activity of the afternoon, became something more complicated, still present, still clear, but changed. Tomlin looked at his face. At those enormous amber eyes, currently carrying something that he did not need to translate and would not have known how to put into words even if he had tried. Something that he recognized from the inside of himself on certain evenings when the village grew quiet and his family was occupied and the particular variety of alone that wasn't comfortable settled over him. Something that was the look of a creature that had had company and now saw it leaving and was doing the work of making peace with the leaving without yet being sure it could. Tomlin understood it. He understood it so completely and so quickly that it bypassed his brain and arrived directly in his chest, and the thing it did there was not quite hurt but was adjacent to hurt, was the feeling of recognizing something painful that belongs to someone else and wishing, without the ability to fix it, that it didn't exist. He reached into his pocket. The stone was there. The good stone, the heavy round one, the one that had started the whole of this day at 30 feet above a trail he was forbidden on, the one that had ridden with him through the fall and the cold and the hours of play. He held it in his palm for a moment through his glove, feeling its weight, feeling its roundness, feeling the deep, satisfying quality of it that had drawn him to it in the first place. Then he crouched down, slow and deliberate, and placed it on the canyon floor in the space between them. He set it down carefully, not dropped, not tossed, placed, with the attention of someone putting something important somewhere it will be looked after. He took his hand away and stood up and looked at Vreth. "I'll come back," he said. He said it with the same quality he'd put into "that's all right," the quality of meaning it completely, of saying a true thing and wanting it understood as true. Not the reassurance of someone trying to end a difficult moment, not the promise of someone who will forget by morning. The statement of an 8-year-old boy who knew, with the clear, simple certainty of someone who had just found something rare, that he was coming back to this canyon the way you go back to a place that has become necessary. Tomorrow, if I can manage it. He considered the logistics honestly. Disappearing for a second consecutive day after the conversation that was waiting for him at home would require either excellent luck or a degree of planning he wasn't sure he had time to complete tonight. The day after at the latest. Vreth looked at the stone. He looked at it for a moment that had length to it, that was not simply the automatic glance of a creature nodding a new object in its space, but the considered attention of a creature deciding something. Then he extended one claw carefully, with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything today, the kind of careful that is chosen rather than instinctive, and dragged the stone toward himself. Slowly across the canyon floor, the sound of it a soft scrape against the rock, until it was against his chest, and then he curled around it slightly, the curve of his lower neck and the inside of his foreleg enclosing it, tucking it close with a possessiveness that was so clean and complete and simple that it hit Tomlin somewhere under his sternum with a force he hadn't anticipated. It was the gesture of a creature that believed in tomorrow. Not a creature that hoped for tomorrow, not a creature that was trying to believe. A creature that had accepted the promise with enough certainty to claim the token, to hold it, to keep it safe against the arrival of what the promise described. A creature that had looked at the stone and understood that Tomlin meant what he said, and had decided to hold the meaning physically, to give it weight and shape and warmth against its chest through the night, because it was real and it was worth holding. Something in Tomlin's own chest settled. Like a stone finding its place in a collection, not forced, not managed, just finding the space that was the right size for it and resting there. He straightened up. He looked at the canyon wall and found the route. There was always a route, you just had to look calmly and not panic. A series of ledges on the west face that would bring him out above the canyon and back to the lower trail. Not difficult. 20 minutes of climbing, manageable in the remaining light if he started now. He started now. He climbed with scraped palms that registered their complaint on every handhold, and the singed patch on his sleeve, and the torn knee of his breeches, and the feeling. The feeling was the largest thing he carried and the only thing that had no weight to it. The only thing that cost him nothing to carry. The feeling of having found something rare by accident in the exact place you weren't supposed to be. He had no word for it because he was 8, and the word for it was the kind of word that takes years to arrive, that waits until you have enough experience to understand what it's nomming. But he felt its shape completely. It was warm, and it was large, and it fit in his chest alongside everything else without crowding anything. He reached the top of the canyon wall and stopped for a moment, breathing, looking back down. Vreth was on his ledge. He had climbed back up, or perhaps he had always been there, watching the ascent, and he was settled in the way Tomlin had not yet seen him settled, without the restlessness of the playing or the alertness of the initial encounter. He was simply present, weight low, tail curled close, the stone tucked against him. His head was up and directed toward where Tomlin stood on the canyon rim, and even from this distance the amber of his eyes caught the last of the flattening evening light. They looked at each other across the vertical distance, boy and dragon, in the cold mountain air with the blue deepening around them, and the first stars beginning to suggest themselves above the eastern ridge. Then Tomlin turned and walked down the trail toward home, toward the conversation that was waiting, toward the explanation he would have to give for the scraped hands and the singed sleeve and the torn knee. He walked quickly because quickly was necessary, but he did not walk with the empty feeling of a day that had run out of itself. He walked with tomorrow in his chest, solid and round and heavy in the best way, the way the good stone had been heavy in his pocket. Behind him, on the ledge in the Ashenspire Mountains, Vreth watched the boy's shape diminish down the trail until the trail's turning took it from view. Then he sat with the goneness of it for a moment, the canyon quiet again, the echo in the far wall carrying nothing now because there was nothing to echo, the mountain air settling back into the ordinary depth of its silence. He looked at the stone against his chest, round and gray and still warm from the canyon floor. He curled tighter around it, tucked his tail against his flank, pressed his nose to the stone's surface and breathed in the smell of it, rock and cold, and something that was now also something else. Something that had been added to it today by small human hands that had carried it through a fall and an afternoon of play and set it down with the care of a promise. Smoke rose from his nostrils in slow spirals, patient and even, the smoke of a creature at rest rather than in motion, winding up into the cold dark air and dissolving without haste. He would wait, he was good at waiting, he had been good at waiting for longer than this afternoon, had spent weeks in the waiting that had nothing to wait for. But this was different. This was the waiting you do when the thing you are waiting for is real, when it has a shape and a name and a direction from which it will arrive. When the waiting is not just time passing but time moving towards something. He had someone to wait for now. The difference between that and simply waiting was enormous, was the difference between an echo and a voice, between the wall dragon and the boy on the canyon floor, between a stone tower knocked down in private and a game played in the specific friction and joy of another presence. The mountain echoed the same as always, vast and cold and old and permanent, carrying the sound of wind through its passages and the distant crack of ice and the small movements of creatures in their places. It echoed the same as it had every night before this one. But on the ledge, a small dragon with emberdark scales and amber eyes and ivory nubs of growing horns lay curled around a smooth gray stone with the patient spiraling certainty of a creature that had found, without going to the lowlands, without leaving the mountain, in the exact place it had been told to stay. Something that had changed the mountain entirely. Not the stone or the canyon or the echo in the far wall. Just the knowledge that tomorrow existed and was coming, and was going to bring with it a boy with scraped hands and a wool cap and an inexhaustible interest in good stones, and a way of saying that's all right that meant more than the words. The stars arrived one by one over the Ashenspire Mountains. And for the first time in a long time, Vreth did not watch them in the way that empty things are watched. He watched them in the way that a creature watches things while it is waiting for morning.